I often like to say that science is a dialogue with nature. And so, over the last 2 years, climate has been telling us that the main theories, the models, and our expectations were wrong, at least in part. And that's not an easy story that the climate is telling us. It doesn't mean we face a necessarily safer or more optimistic situation. It means we face a wider one, a more complex one that we're not working on fully. And so it doesn't mean that carbon gases aren't really important, but it means that other human influence factors are perhaps more important right now to address, particularly because they've not been focused on as much as we could. And those are the factors that I'm calling biohydrological factors. So how the clouds that cool our planet are seeded naturally from phytoplankton in the oceans and from large forests.
Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmons. I'm the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, and I'm extra thrilled to introduce our guest today, the influential and often provocative Emeritus Professor of Sustainability Leadership at the University of Cumbria in the UK, Jem Bendell. Jem is best known for coining the term deep adaptation and writing extensively about that. It's a powerful framework that confronts the likelihood of societal collapse in the coming decades, and in some places already underway. His groundbreaking 2018 paper on deep adaptation has been downloaded over 1 million times. Yes, that's 1 million. It's a testament to the resonance of his ideas. On a personal note, I first encountered Jem's work shortly after the paper's release, and in 2019 I joined a small group at a transformative retreat on the coast of Greece, led by Jem and Katie Carr. We explored deep adaptation, not just as an intellectual concept, but as a deeply personal guide for navigating our lives and our communities. And so this week, I'm really delighted that we have the opportunity to have Jem here, who basically, in my experience of him, represents and articulates a whole series of dimensions, not just the intellectual, but the aspect of personal growth and feelings and the whole person. He brings the whole person to this experience. So he's been on a remarkable personal and professional journey. He's authored or co-authored two insightful books, and I particularly recommend to our viewers that they read his thought-provoking book called Breaking Together, A Freedom-Loving Response in Collapse. He's also relocated to Bali, where he joins us today. In our conversation, we'll explore his evolving views on deep adaptation, in particular in light of recent research and advocacy around large-scale ocean and ecosystem restoration, forests and more, as a potential way to cool the planet and mitigate some of the collapse that seems almost inevitable. Longtime viewers of the Climate Emergency Forum will remember Jem as our guest for several stimulating conversations from the sidelines of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Regular viewers may also recall our discussions this summer with Rob Dillette, Peter Bunyard, and Brew Pierce, who also touched on similar themes of ecological restoration. Today, Jem joins our regular contributors, Dr. Peter Carter and Paul Beckwith, for what promises to be a thoughtful, provocative, and perhaps even, if I could use the word, cautiously optimistic conversation. And to our viewers, I urge you to stay until the end when I'll share a brief update on some of the latest and most critical news relating to the climate crisis. So, Jem, let's get started. First, I want to ask to share a bit about your personal journey and your professional one that started with deep adaptation and has changed you in presumably many ways, and both intellectually and also geographically. And then we'll be eager to hear your views on the potential of large-scale eco restoration as a critical climate emergency action. So, as always, so happy to have you here, Jem, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for that informative and very kind introduction, Herb. And I have great memories of us spending time together. And thank you also for Paul and Peter for joining. Yeah, I'm joining you from Indonesia, which is home. So yeah, my inquiry into the environmental situation, the predicament we're in, the tragedy we're in, the emergency we're in with climate change. Yeah, it changed my life, literally. And so I stepped away from academia. I moved to Bali. I set up an organic farm school. I got involved in music. I also broadened my attention to intellectual matters. So I previously, as an academic, I was very focused on what's called corporate sustainability, and therefore I had to know everything about how organizations perform and leaders grow and so on. But then I started to allow my curiosity, to allow my heart to guide me in terms of what to look into. So psychology, philosophy, spirituality, and so on. But I'm with you today because I also continued to pay attention to what's happening in the climate, because my perception of what's happening with the climate changed my life back in 2018. It shocked me. It threw me into despair. So naturally, I pay attention to it. What we've seen in the last 2 years, 2.5 years, with data on temperatures in the oceans and in the air has been, yeah, what we've seen is shocking. It's been worse than even people who are considered alarmists like myself were anticipating just 7 years ago. So that really got me to look again. And I did look again a bit at the end of 2022 for my book Breaking Together. Thank you. So I have a chapter there where I update my analysis from Deep Adaptation paper. But also, yeah, this year we're speaking in 2025. So yeah, this year I also, the first 6 months, I started looking again at what could be explaining what's happening. So I think that's why I'm back on talking about the climate and climate science and how we can interpret that, what maybe needs more attention, and what the implications are for those of us who consider ourselves environmentally engaged. So what I should say first is that I'm sharing my analysis on the climate and on climate science, not as a climatologist, but someone with skills in research analysis. Over the years, I've studied methodology, epistemology, ontology, these fancy words, which basically are about how do we think we know what we know. I also look at the institutional and ideological dynamics within any field of scholarship when analyzing it. So, yeah, I'll look at not just the conclusions coming out of, say, the peak body in a particular area and the top scientific papers, but I'll also look at, well, why were the questions being asked? How has the field developed over time? What are some of its foundational assumptions? Because, yeah, we know that any field of scientific endeavor not only inquires into reality, but also is a community of practice, a community that shares a set of assumptions and has institutional structures and funding and career progression and so on. So the history and philosophy of science shows us that not only do we get brilliant insights from any field of scholarship, but also we have self-restricting paradigms that over time change. And often the people who annoy the top scientists in any particular field are the ones who are pointing to a needed paradigm shift. So, back in 2018, my deep adaptation paper, which you mentioned, Herb, was the result of that work. And looking back now, 7 years later, I was right to conclude that climate change was accelerating. And I concluded that from just looking at the latest data back then on sea level rise. And I saw that sea level rise was accelerating, and I saw that as an indicator of changes in the whole Earth system. Mainstream climatology was not saying that at the time. And sadly, I was also right back then to conclude that we will go through 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. It's inevitable. And also, that wasn't being concluded at the time. And to say that publicly was upsetting to some people because they assumed that meant giving up. It didn't at all. But that's what's happened in the field of climatology. People kind of anticipate what someone's reaction might be. It's all become very tribal, and that doesn't help curiosity. So it doesn't help the doing of science. Yeah, and I really discovered that. I mean, I got a lot of, I think, did you call me provocative or controversial? I can't remember. Those two words used for me. And I don't, it's not that I'm setting out to be that, but coming at a field from outside that field can annoy people who are are career professionals within a particular area, in this case, climatology, can also annoy people who wish to defer to authority. And so they can accuse people like myself as cherry picking data and findings, when actually what we're doing, I think, is significance picking from a messy bush of papers and data in a particular field. So I would say now that it's even gaslighting humanity to sneer at the researchers who are being persistently more accurate than the peak body in climatology, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So their 2021 assessment anticipated that this year, 2025, would be about 1.2 degrees C above pre-industrial temperatures. That was in their worst case scenario. So currently, as we speak, the last 12 months have been over 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial, and the World Meteorological Organization, I think in their May report, said that it's likely that the next 5 years will average over 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. I often like to say that science is a dialogue with nature, and so over the last 2 years, climate has been telling us that the main theories, the models, and our expectations were wrong, at least in part. And that's not an easy story that the climate is telling us. It doesn't mean we face a necessarily safer or more optimistic situation. It means we face a wider one, a more complex one that we're not working on fully. And so it doesn't mean that carbon gases aren't really important, but it means that other human influence factors are perhaps more important right now to address, particularly because they've not been focused on as much as we could. And those are the factors that I'm calling biohydrological factors. So how the clouds that cool our planet are seeded naturally from phytoplankton in the oceans and from large forests. Looking back on my research in 2017, 2018, that led to the Deep Adaptation paper, I think I didn't realize that my attention to ecological systems had been framed by this carbon centrism, and I wasn't looking at the crucial biohydrological feedbacks as I could have been. I looked at some feedbacks like, reflectivity from an albedo due to ice, but I didn't look at clouds as much as I could have done. And so I've become more aware of those biohydrological processes, and I've become aware that perhaps the Earth system science field has so much more to offer than just looking at the dynamics of carbon feedbacks. We need to look at the biohydrological processes. So yeah, I therefore felt I needed, because I do have an audience in climatology, particularly from the activist community, I thought I needed to update my public communications on this, and so wrote an essay about moving beyond climate dogmas. This fight between those who say it's all about carbon dioxide and those who say it's all a climate scam. We need to just move beyond that and be more curious, do better science, communicate science better, and invite more attention to protecting large forests and restoring the health of the world's oceans as the front line of the climate fight right now, not just as the secondary thing after we do something about carbon emissions.
And that's where you are now. And from what you've said, and I think if I understand it, I would share that the possibilities are some people are saying are enormous of cooling the planet through large scale preservation and restoration of ecosystems, but that the research, the evidence is really thin right now, or it's emerging, maybe is maybe a better way to say it, and is nowhere near sort of prime time, if you will. And that's a challenge both for advocates and opponents. Is that a fair assessment, Jim?
Yeah, so if we just take the concept of a biotic pump where large forests helps cycle moisture, Also, if we take the theories around large forests are seeding clouds not just above them, but regionally and even globally because of the bacteria and pollen they give off into the atmosphere. So, for example, there's a study which shows that what happens in the Amazon influences snowfall in Tibet. If we look at that, then yeah, how do these dynamics work? Unfortunately, the science is not sufficiently sort of nailed down for it to be put into most models at the level it could be, and for it to be seen as high confidence conclusion for the IPCC. Now, that doesn't mean these are super significant processes that are methodologies from a somewhat mechanistic worldview means that they're not going to be accepted. Now, why is this the case? Well, it's not because there aren't top scientists around the world talking about these things for many years. There are. There's a 2017 paper with 22 climatologists from around the world that was saying that we must look more and do a lot more work on the role of large forests in climate regulation. And it was published, I think, in the top scientific journal, Nature. So I cite that in my essay on climate dogmas. So it's not as if this hasn't been put out there. It's just the dynamics within climatology have just funded major focus on carbon dioxide and framed it that way. I'm not arguing against that. It's yes, that's good research to do, and we've needed to know a lot better knowledge on the natural processes. For example, there are very few studies on how phytoplankton produce dimethyl sulfide and therefore seed clouds, not just over the oceans, but also then over forests. This is an area whereby, therefore, some people can say, well, there's not enough research and we need to win the argument in the court of public opinion and persuade policymakers, and therefore this is interesting, but we shouldn't distract from emissions cuts and drawdown. I disagree. We have a climate emergency, which, as I said at the start, cannot be explained from within existing carbon-centric view. The last 2 years cannot be explained by that, and some climatologists say it publicly now, like Gavin Schmidt from NASA, and many climatologists say it privately. Unfortunately, quite a few climatologists are saying, oh no, this is more or less what our models are saying, and they say, and if it's not, then it's only because of cutting or cleaning up shipping fuel emissions and the reduction in aerosol cloud seeding from that. And so they want to keep telling us a story that, yeah, no, don't keep respecting us. We still know what's going on. And no, this is too important. This issue is more important than just to be left to the climatologists and all the institutional dynamics that naturally occur within any profession.
Well, let me
Um,
stop you there at a very important point, and I just wanted to make one comment, and then I'm going to introduce Paul Beckwith. When you mentioned the biotic pump, because it's not a well-known phenomena yet, I would just recommend the work of the Russian scientist Anastasia Makavera, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. We'll put a link to her work in there. She is one of the world's preeminent scholars and activists in that area. And it's really provocative and important work. And thanks for bringing that up, Jim. So let me turn it over to Paul Beckwith. Paul, as you know from watching the program, is a climate system scientist who lives in Ottawa, has taught at universities in the Ottawa area. He hosts a prodigiously popular YouTube program with over 1,500 videos and millions of viewers. And as always, we're delighted to have you here, Paul. And I know you've talked with Jem on this program years ago. And here's your opportunity to continue that conversation now.
Thank you, Jem, for all your insights. I think it's vital information that we need to figure out ways to get more people to understand it. And, it comes back to the view of, we tend to slot ourselves into different tribes, even in science. So biologists and chemists and climatologists, and, people become overly specialized and they forget that what they're doing is one small niche. It's like they're looking at the world through blinders, and we need those people to look very deeply into the topics of their expertise, but we also need just as many people to have a much broader view, a systems view of what's happening We don't have enough of that because it's not funded to the same extent. It's not dealt by society to the same extent. And the people that are specialized and have blinders on and are focused on a specialized topic go and call these other people, hand wavers or cherry pickers or whatever. They have all kinds of names, and they seem to be opposed to people like you, and I would say myself also, who really try to look at the system and how all the pieces fit together. So, I mean, you really hit it on the nail on the head with your analysis of why climate has accelerated, why temperatures have accelerated and spiked just in the last few years. The Earth is a darker place. We've actually reduced the ability of the Earth to reflect sunlight back into space. So, of course, it's warming up. And the problem in the oceans, you get a stratification or a layering of the water. You don't get the vertical mixing that is needed to bring nutrients up to feed those phytoplankton. And of course, the phytoplankton produce the dimethyl sulfide, which is one of the most powerful ways to create clouds naturally. And you also very nicely talk about the ability of the forest through evapotranspiration. They're putting that pollen and those bacteria into the sky, which then act as, and that water vapor that they evapotranspirate rises up, condenses into droplets, and you're converting a gas into a liquid, and therefore the pressure has to lower, as you mentioned. And this is sort of the impetus of the biotic pump, because that lower pressure then sucks in air from over the ocean in the case of the Amazon, which then adds to the whole water cycle. So the importance of trees for all of these things is vital. I would add that the symbiotic relationship of the actual trees with fungi, especially the symbiotic fungi that are part of the root system of trees, is equally vital. And we're losing a lot of that fungi from things like nitrous oxides, which is, another powerful greenhouse gas. I guess the important thing is we need more and more people to look at the climate system as a whole and to get recognition for their research. I mean, you see it starting to head that way, but it's nowhere near that way at the moment. So I think what you're saying is vitally important. I love that you took a year off to just look at climate science. You were worried about climate 2017, you stopped your teaching, your university stuff. You took a year to study climate. I think that should be mandated by governments. Everybody should take a year off and learn about climate and get funding from the government so they can do that, and we could go a lot better to addressing some of these issues. So I think it's vital information. So thank you. It's not really
Yeah.
a question, it's really an
Yeah.
endorsement of everything you've said.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And I enjoyed the way that you've clarified the processes that are involved with how forests cool the climate and how phytoplankton in healthy oceans cool the climate. These are quite complex processes. And so, yeah, it's important to be able to explain them clearly as you do. And it was good, Herb, that you mentioned Anastasia Makarieva. I don't know how to pronounce the name either. She's been doing this for 20 years. And what's fascinating is that it seems that within Russia, there are very similar ideas to in the UK with the Gaia hypothesis. It's this similar idea of what I'm now calling like a pan-ecological paradigm. The idea that complex living systems are involved in everything on planet Earth and therefore involved in producing the climate that we have. And there are so many complex feedbacks that we'll never be able to fully understand it. But using our reductionist determinist methodologies is useful, but does not give us the whole truth. And therefore, we need to be careful that we're not occluding our vision on crucial processes because it just doesn't fit with our agreed methodologies or agreed processes of consensus building within a scholarly field. So it's difficult to know like, how should the IPCC respond to this? Well, I would argue at a minimum would be to call for a massive amount of new research in this area. And secondly, because the jeopardy is so high, if we continue to displace attention to preserving large forests and to looking after the oceans, if we're just focusing on emissions reduction, we should make sure that we're never using a low carbon energy transition story to justify the destruction of large forests, for example, or the poisoning of oceans through runoff. So it's ridiculous that with the COP in Brazil, you will literally have people who confidently think that the Amazon, the trees, doesn't matter. What matters is getting the metals from underneath those trees. In order to enable a rapid low energy transition. So we need to wake the world up to the complexity of this agenda. And otherwise, it's super sad. You've got these people who are doing great work with the best of intentions to help cool the climate, but from a very narrow, as you call, tribal paradigm that it's only about carbon emissions reductions or carbon drawdown. And you've even got people like Bill Gates, therefore, talking about trees, where he says, are we the scientific people or are we the idiots saying that trees don't matter?
I just want to stress too that the pressures on trees are phenomenal. Tree mortality in Canada's boreal
Yeah.
forest, for example, has doubled in the last decade or two. Of course, now we're dealing with massive wildfires, record wildfires in Canada in 2023, and second highest this year, 2025. Also, the stresses to the ocean. I mean, I mentioned the stratification, but there's also the ocean acidification is very detrimental to the plankton in the ocean. And, the recent report from Exeter on global tipping points says we've crossed the tipping point for coral reefs. And probably people don't realize, but dimethyl sulfide production of plankton over coral reefs is much, much higher than it is over just about any other surface of the ocean. So losing coral reefs, not just the
Yes.
beauty, but we're losing that production capability of dimethyl sulfide, which then creates the cloud condensation nuclei. So that it's all connected together, and we need far more people talking about these connections. Like, I agree completely with you.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. If
what?
I could just, I want to
Mhm.
give Peter time. I'm sure we'll have time to continue the conversation. From the west coast of Canada, Dr. Peter Carter. Welcome, Peter. I'd like to indicate to everybody that you have been an expert reviewer for the IPCC, which we have just mentioned, and you have the Climate Emergency Institute that you founded and that you operate. So, Peter, welcome. Whatever you'd like to ask or say to Jem, the floor is yours.
Thanks. It's quite delightful listening to you, I must say, Jim. I remember reading your 2018, although I thought I read something in 2017, and I thought, wow, here's a new name to me, and he gets it. He gets it all. And the scientists, I've always been aware, have never actually got it all, the experts. So it's great work that you're doing, great work. There's just a few words that I want to throw out that you mentioned, which are really, really important. One, conversation, dialogue. You've progressed that to your beta crisis, which is really good terminology, I think. You mentioned paradigm shift. Wow, I haven't heard paradigm shift for years, but of course, yes, that's exactly what we need. You mentioned Gaia, James Lovelock, of course. He was great. A little bit like you in a sense, probably you follow on in his footsteps. You mentioned protection and restoration of nature. I love that. And that is the central key because nature is the center of all of this problems and solutions and really is excluded from science. Whereas 100 years ago, science was actually based on nature. I'd be very happy to hear you talk a little bit more about those. But before, I checked you up on Wikipedia just before I came on here. And I found out something that maybe none of us probably knew. Here it is, very short statement. In 2022, Bendell attended the climate conference in Egypt, giving two speeches with warnings to the delegates. First, there will be a spike in global temperatures due to the reduction in aerosols. Second, there will be a rise in a new kind of global skepticism with regard to any action as motivated or as authoritarianism. Wow. Yeah, just carry on and explain some of those key terms that I jotted down. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and thanks for the work you've been doing. I must say, yeah, this most people in the environmental profession or environmental movement are understandably too busy to look at the climate research themselves. They're too busy to look at IPCC reports. They're too busy to look at summaries for policymakers. They tend to rely either on newspaper articles or something in carbonbrief.org or just talking with people. So what's crucially important are people, Paul, you and Peter, people who really, and Herb with your book, people who really make this primary science more quickly and easily available. And so I know many people who rely on the work that you do to stay up to date. And so, yeah, it's crucial work. Not only do we need masses of funding for more research, we really could do with some funding for this translation work so that it's accessible to people, not just in the public, but actually in the environmental professions and environmental movement. One thing I wanted to say was that there is a concept of something called post-normal science, and where complexity is high, where the jeopardy from the situation is high, where the time is super critical to outcomes and to whether that hazard becomes real. You need to have rapid action based on limited knowledge, where so long as the actions you take don't also carry very high risks. And this is the field of post-normal science. And so, yes, we need lots more research onto these biohydrological processes, but I think prior to that, we need to accept this kind of common sense understanding that science should enable action rather than delay it. So we shouldn't have people saying, "Oh, well, we just need to wait until we got more knowledge and clarity, and we can fit this appropriately into the top models and into the next IPCC assessment report." We need to accept the post-normal science insight, which is that if the jeopardy is high and time is short and the processes are super complex, but we can act now without major risk, then we should do it. And therefore, we need to have a global awakening to the need for rapid conservation of large forests and reforestation of the areas around them. Because unfortunately, the issue here, the implication is not that we all just need to start planting trees. Yeah, that's nice. And it also is a conversation starter. But we need a certain size of forests to have this global, regional and global cloud seeding role from the forests. So we all need to be going back to the traditional environmentalism, the one I started out with when I got my first job at the Worldwide Fund for Nature in 1995 with the Forest Unit in the UK, of just looking at what are the pressures on forests. We've got the traditional pressures, we know, mining, agriculture, urban sprawl, logging, but we also got the new pressures, which you mentioned, Paul, which is that we've got, unfortunately, stressed forests because of existing climate change and therefore more disease and more die-off and more forest fires. So we need to have an upgraded conservation model, which includes helping forests move, assisted tree migration. It's a massive agenda. I think it needs to be the front line of the climate fight and all hands on deck worldwide. Whether it means we cool the climate in time, I don't know. So I don't talk about solutions. These are remedies and possibilities. So when people hear me talk about this now, they say, "Oh, are you no longer a doomster thinking that collapse is inevitable or underway?" They say, "No, I still am that." Like what's happening with the climate is one aspect of a system, a rapacious global capitalist system, and all the ideologies associated with it. And we are in a situation of ecological overshoot. And so the damage will continue to be done, and there's momentum in the climate system. But we've got to try to ameliorate it. And now I've suddenly discovered in the last few years that the agenda is far broader than just carbon emissions cuts and drawdown. So yeah, I have had an emotional shift with that, which is not to just talk about adaptation, not to just sort of think about changing my life locally. But this seems to be like an invitation back to global environmental activism. This seems to be an invitation to tell the world famous conservation NGOs like Sierra Club, Conservation International, Greenpeace, Worldwide Fund for Nature, hey, you've been marginalized by this carbon-centric story that's dominated environmentalism over the last 20 years. When actually the work you were doing to look after the oceans and look after the world's pristine, amazing forests was central to the future of humanity. Not just because environmentalists liked pretty, pristine ecosystems and charismatic species. No, your stuff is massively important for the world's climate, the future of humanity. Now, pull yourselves together and get out there and shout that message from the rooftops. Stop just going along to the COPs and sort of trying to explain yourselves and get a little bit of funding in the carbon paradigm.
Thank you so much for all those provocative comments. You're going to have to promise before you leave to come back so we can expand on some of those key issues you're bringing up tonight, Jem. But in the meantime, I want to turn it back to Paul. Paul, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I really like some of the framing that you've used. So you talked about framing as collapse, catastrophe, and extinction. So three different framings. And then you've talked about probabilities of things occurring. So you mentioned three, and I would say there's four. Your three are possible, probable, or inevitable. And then I would also ask, say impossible would probably be a fourth one, for people that are saying, well, nothing's happening. But that framing is very interesting. It would be interesting to survey politicians and the general public with those sort of framings to get an idea as to, what people really felt. I mean, you've mentioned that your particular views are inevitable collapse, probable catastrophe, and possible extinction. So I think I have to agree with those things. I'm wondering, has this gone into any survey that you're aware of, this type of framing? Because I think it's very important to sort of find out where people stand. I'd certainly like to know where politicians stand before I, voted for any of them, for example.
Yeah, so that framing was from the Deep Adaptation paper in 2018, and that I realized that with complex information where we're trying to assess the implications for society and for humanity into the future, we don't know the future. So we kind of have these framings or gut feels that we live with. And so I was constantly asked, oh, how long have we got and what's going to happen? And so I said, well, let's unpack this a bit. And so I said, so societal collapse, by which I mean the uneven ending of the normal modes of sustenance and shelter and communication and transaction and entertainment and meaning making and so on. Life as we know it, life as we've learned to, life as we've grown up in. If that's breaking down, and can't be repaired, then collapse is an appropriate term. So that's what I mean by that. And I've even progressed from saying it's inevitable to say, well, actually, it's quite apparent for many societies already and for many
Already.
people in these societies. So it's already underway. And if we frame it in the way I've just explained, catastrophe as in mega death. So billions of people dying earlier than what we would expect from current life expectancy. Sadly, and it's super painful to say this, to feel it, to take it to heart. It still is if we allow ourselves. I still think it's probable. And I think this new stuff that we've talked about today, new for me at least, in the last year or two, the pan-ecological paradigm, the attention to large forests and healthy oceans, this doesn't make avoiding that catastrophe more likely. It makes avoiding that catastrophe of megadeath possible. But sadly, humanity's not prioritizing it, not working on it. So
Mhm.
it could make it more likely because of a lack of global human response, public response. So, and then there's a conversation. Okay, well, what can we do about it? Like what kind of strategy and tactics would meet that challenge to save billions of lives, let alone wider life on Earth? And then extinction, human extinction. Yeah, I mean, talking about what we're talking about today should not distract us from paying attention to, for example, the potential for and evidence for massive methane release from the Arctic or anywhere else under the oceans. And so there could still be like super catastrophic climate changes, which would make human extinction in the near term something to worry about. It's crazy. And as I said in the Deep Adaptation paper, it's crazy that we've got ourselves, we're a smart species, supposedly, with massive technology and power, and we've got ourselves into this situation where we can credibly talk about risks of human extinction. And it's just shocking. It's ridiculous. This should be like top of the agenda and we should be working on it. And yet we're not. We're just talking about whatever Trump said yesterday or what. Yeah, it's just tiresome, isn't it?
Maybe
Yep.
our priority should be to get one billionaire somewhere in the world on board with what we're talking about and doing. And, they can come step forward and fund what we need to do.
I'm very happy for people to do that. And I'm also very happy to try that. Absolutely. And put their heart and soul into it. And I will introduce you to a couple of billionaires I know. Um, and and I'm also very supportive of people who think that won't happen and therefore are more inclined to do their bit where they can. So maybe they have the ear of the head of Greenpeace and they want to promote this idea for Greenpeace, or they're a community leader and they want to help their community adapt to the climate changes that are already underway. And that would also include psychological adaptation, so helping people be nice to each other when we get very scared.
Yes, that's a particular challenge. Let me turn it back to Peter for some wrap-up question or comment you'd like to make to Jem.
I'd just like to say I understand a lot better what Jem's been about, and I'm very happy to make that discovery because, as I said before, he's about all the things that we need to be about. We have to go beyond CO2. Yeah, I agree with that. We can't be just saying CO2 is the cause. We can go right back to your rapacious capitalism. That would be much better, be much more productive, right? If we looked at the cause in that manner. I'm also reminded that Jonathan Porritt, he did a really great video some time ago, just a couple of years, in which he called the problem consumerism. I thought that was really, really good. That made me think deeply. So my final question would be, you mentioned the need for us to feel it, right? How do we encourage people to feel it? Because I think that is a key.
It's a good question, and it's a question also, therefore, about how does massive social change happen? And so one view might be we just need one billionaire to feel it and act and fund. And another view would be we need the environmental leaders on the planet to feel it. And the other view would be we need as many people on planet Earth to feel it. People live in very different cultures. I've experienced that here in Indonesia, moving here. The farmers I work with have a very different worldview and identity and story of self and meaning and purpose than, say, some of the international people here. And that's very different. I'm on a Hindu island, but that's very different than from the majority of Indonesia, which is a Muslim country. So there needs to be some attention to those value sets and stories of being about the nature of life, the meaning of life, and how do we reach people at that level? Because they don't hear what we say. People hear what fits with their worldview and their identity and their meaning-making structure. It's not something you can answer quickly or glibly. It's an ongoing question. How am I being heard? In what way am I being heard? Are people pigeonholing me here over here and this information? So, for example, in some Christian communities and congregations, they're hearing this kind of information and just fitting it into, oh yeah, this is the end times, so I'll just go to church more often and preach the gospel. And okay, great, but doesn't make them radical climate activists, which is, I think, what we need. So you've got to try and understand the audiences and who's listening. So for me, I engage in communities like this one because it's almost like a bridge. So the people who watch this are likely to be the people who can then interpret this stuff and then in their own lives and communities translate it. They might be in a Christian community. They might be in an environmental NGO group. They might be, whatever. So we can do our bit, and then other people will have to think about how this lands in their particular communities they're engaged in.
Thank you, Jem. That was very articulate and sobering, but anything different than sobering would not be realistic, would it? That's the challenge we have. That's why climate change is often called a wicked problem.
I want to know what you think we should do on this issue, Herb.
Oh, I'm in the billionaire camp.
Uh-huh.
I think I mentioned that seriously. In fact, I have a call with somebody who has contacts with billionaires in a day or two. I mean, and that's again, that's not in the when I say in the camp, I mean, I think, we need to do everything. I mean, I would get a billionaire together with this group of conservation groups that you've talked about and sit them down with you moderating the conversation, Jem, you know, and the conservation group saying, oh my goodness, we've got to rethink our role. And the billionaire getting excited and saying, all right, well, I'm going to give you $100 million to help you rethink your role as one.
Revive and reinvigorate our role.
Yes. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. But we could go on for hours. I'm sure many of our viewers would want to stay and continue, but instead, we're going to get you to commit yourself to come back sometime and continue this incredible conversation. I know I speak for Paul and Peter and Charles and Heidi behind the scenes, and thanking you so much, not just for the thoughtfulness and depth of your ideas and articulation tonight, but everything you've done the past 6 years or more and how you've had the courage to evolve. I mean, you're a different person, a different message today than you were a year or two ago, and we can't say that about a whole lot of people. So my deepest appreciation then, and I'm going to turn away for the last segment briefly, just bring some updates since our last conversation on the Climate Emergency Forum with some news. And ironically, and it's truly, sometimes you say there are no coincidences, but in looking at the latest news today, most of it was about forests, ironically, and very little is great news, but it's a sobering counterpoint to what we've talked about. So, very briefly, it was announced that the world lost almost 11 million hectares of forest each year over the past decade. While this is less than we've lost before, I mean, we need to be gaining forests, not losing it. A different UN report found that annual spending on forests must increase to triple to 300 billion by 2030 to meet climate and nature goals. And it's also, and interestingly, it's noted that agriculture caused 86% of global deforestation in the past decade. And that, of course, opens up a whole other conversation that I hope we can have some time. And then the counterpoint to that, and this gets to what was mentioned about the rapacious capitalism, an investigation from a group called Global Witness found that banks and asset managers around the world generated $26 billion from, quote, financing deforesting companies through investments, loans, and financial services in the last decade. Big surprise, US financial institutions earned the biggest gains. In the meantime, the EU delayed its anti-deforestation law and on and on and on. This is the sort of the reality. The last couple of things, there was a major global biodiversity conference in Montreal. Some of you may have gone. And basically, what they're finding is that just 28% of the countries who attended that and made commitments to develop plans for biodiversity have met the deadline of submitting those plans. And on and on and on. The last thing I want to say relates to something that's particularly close to my heart, which is words and language, and something I saw just before coming on tonight, and I found it hard to believe, but I'll follow up on it. Nature-related words, however that's measured, have decreased by 60% since 1800, and the number of technology related words has increased by a comparable amount. Though we even are using fewer words to describe and experience nature because we're not experiencing it. So these are all sobering trends. That doesn't mean that we don't get up every morning with our ideas and our ambitions. Again, let me thank everyone here for an amazing conversation. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, basically tell your friends and your colleagues. We are one of the few, if any, channels that focus just on the climate emergency. Go to our website, climateemergencyforum.org, press that little round donate button so we can continue providing what is now almost 260 videos over the last few years. And please come back and watch us as we return to give you another program next week. Thanks to Jem, thanks to Paul, thanks to Peter, and good night and goodbye, everyone.